Their gift to the community became a symbol of how faith can bridge any divide. The sun beat down on the Mojave Desert with a relentless, punishing authority, baking the air until it tasted of dust and raw heat. Inside the boxcars, the journey of more than 1,000 miles, spanning oceans and half a continent, finally ended with the grinding hiss of steam brakes and the profound silence of an alien, desolate landscape. Among the prisoners was Karl Hess, a man hardened by years as a combat engineer on the Eastern Front, captured only weeks before in the collapsing ruins of the Reich. He was 30 years old, his uniform threadbare, his eyes filled with the grim expectation that America would enact the cruel revenge German propaganda had promised. Forced labor, starvation, and the crack of a rifle butt. Every rumor and leaflet disseminated back home had painted the United States as a nation of avarice and brutality, eager to grind its enemies into the desert sand. When the doors slid open, Karl braced himself instinctively for the customary riot of shouting and rifle butts. Instead, he met a peculiar, unsettling calm. The men were ushered into the intense heat and directed toward a dusty compound surrounded, surprisingly, not by high concrete walls, but simple, neat rows of barbed wire. This was Camp Cady, a prisoner of war facility built deliberately in the middle of nowhere, its isolation serving as its primary, natural guard. Karl noted the chilling American organization instantly. Precise rows of barracks, an orderly mess hall, and towering water tanks that gleamed like silver under the merciless sky. His skepticism was profound. This orderly environment had to be a trick, the unnerving calm before the punishment began in earnest. He waited for the shouting to start, for the whips and the starvation, but the guards moved with a strange, professional calm. The American Army was operating under strict rules that meant the men were registered, assigned bunks with clean linens, and given a meal of hot beef stew, fresh bread, and real coffee, a startling abundance of food far better than the rations Karl had seen in months. He observed Sergeant Miller, in charge of their work details, whose manner was patient and entirely devoid of malice. Miller spoke through a neutral interpreter, explaining that prisoners were expected to work for a small wage in camp script. "This camp has needs," Miller stated simply. "We have the labor, you have the skills, this is simply pragmatic." Karl, still reeling from the unexpected decency, tried desperately to find the flaw in the logic. He was a combat engineer. His training was to demolish and fight, not build for his captors. But his pride as a German professional remained immense. If he was forced to build, it would be with competence. The next morning, the men were marched not to quarries or trenches, but to a newly delivered stack of clean lumber. Crates held precision tools, hammers, planes, and powerful circular saws. Karl watched the sergeant distribute the supplies, trying to reconcile the sight of quality tools with the image of savage captors. They were asked to build new administrative offices for the camp staff. As Sergeant Miller handed Karl a brand new, heavy carpentry level, he spoke with a tone of quiet challenge. "You are an engineer, yes? We expect high quality from you. Get to work, Engineer Hess." The men, momentarily forgetting their status as captives, began immediately to inspect the quality of the wood. A current of professional respect, entirely unexpected, flowed between the two groups. It was not the sound of chains that rang across the Mojave air that morning, but the clean, resonant thud of fresh lumber being set into place, signaling a different kind of imprisonment, one defined by dignified work, not malice. Karl took the heavy level, its steel cool against his palm, and knew that whatever cage America had prepared for him, it was certainly not the one he had been taught to fear. You've seen the first twist. Subscribe now to see how this incredible building gets designed and built by the men who were supposed to hate America. The desert sun rose higher each morning, painting the new lumber a deep gold as the prisoners began their construction, yet the air remained thick with tension, waiting for the real punishment to begin. Karl Hess found himself confronting a different kind of challenge, the unrelenting demand for professional perfection. The commission was simple: several single-story offices and a storage depot. For the American Army, the construction was purely practical. For the German prisoners, it was an exercise in reclaiming professional dignity and purpose. Sergeant Miller treated them like a foreman. Miller's only expectation was quality. "If you build it well," he often stated, "it stands longer and you'll work less. It was this relentless demand for quality and accountability that earned the men the first sign of agency over their environment. This pragmatic approach was far more disorienting than any cruelty could have been. The men expected contempt. They received accountability. The lumber was true, the nails plentiful, and the American machinery astonishingly efficient. Karl spent days absorbed in drafting, ensuring that every joint was fitted to perfection, every wall plumb. It was a silent act of professional pride, a way of asserting his own immutable worth in a world that had stripped him of everything else. The focus shifted entirely from enduring captivity to mastering the craft. Karl found himself respecting Miller because he was a man who understood and demanded good construction. Miller never shouted, relying instead on concise instructions and quiet trust. One afternoon, as the office block neared completion, Miller approached Karl with a question. He spread a map. "The general population here has no place to gather," Miller explained. "I have authorization for one more building, a simple recreation hall. I need your design, Hess. A place for your men. Make it good. Something for the men that will help them endure the time here." The request hung heavy with implication. The Americans were granting the men agency over their psychological well-being. Karl felt a flicker of creation. A simple recreation hall seemed woefully inadequate. The silent challenge in Miller's eyes urged him to push the boundaries. Karl took the map. The bare need was a rec hall, but the deeper need, the spiritual emptiness, was for sanctuary. He decided to design something ambitious, a structure that would stand as a testament to dignity. Karl had a clear image, a beautiful mission-style structure, its thick walls worthy of the vast desert sky. He would design a sanctuary. Karl Hess sat alone in the small drafting office. The official request was for a utilitarian 600-square-foot recreation hall. But Karl was determined to refuse to draw another impersonal box. His initial sketches were cynical, but the weight of his fellow prisoners' silent need began subtly to shape his pencil. Karl noticed the small groups whispering prayers, Catholics and Protestants united by desolation. They approached Karl quietly, asking if there might be room for an altar, a corner designated for quiet reflection. These requests, Karl realized, were about the fundamental survival of the soul. A recreation hall offered temporary distraction, but only a chapel could offer genuine peace. He deliberately scraped the cynical sketches into the trash. Karl was an engineer first, and he knew how to build structures that lasted against the elements. He spread out a fresh sheet of paper. Inspired by Spanish mission architecture, he drafted thick stone walls, a sturdy bell tower, and deep-set windows. He detailed heavy, arched doorways for a structure meant to stand for centuries. He designated space for a hand-carved altar. When he finished, the design was complex, ambitious, and required materials, stone and stained glass, wildly beyond Camp Cady's basic budget. It was, essentially, a beautifully rendered, architectural act of engineering defiance. He presented the final drawings to Sergeant Miller. Miller slowly unrolled the expansive plans. He looked at the intricate design. "This is not 600 square feet, Hess," Miller said quietly, "and this is certainly not a recreation hall." "It is a chapel, Sergeant," Karl replied. "It will be built well, and it will be a place for dignity. Your specifications, engineer, are impossible, but I like your ambition." He folded the plans. "I told you to design something you could be proud of, Hess. It seems you have." He did not order a change, nor guarantee the materials. He simply told Karl to gather his masons. Karl realized the challenge was now twofold: to build a sanctuary in the desert, and to somehow convince the enemy to help him furnish it with stone and glass. The groundbreaking ceremony for the new chapel was a quiet affair. 30 German prisoners, a handful of American guards, and the ceaseless, indifferent desert wind. Karl Hess held his architectural plans, knowing that the foundation they were laying would be sound, but the decorative elements, the essential dignity of the structure, remained practically impossible. The camp administration only provided the bare minimum. Karl's ambitious design demanded smooth stone and colored glass. He initially saw this deliberate lack of resources as a final, frustrating hurdle imposed by his captors. But Karl was not the only engineer or craftsman in the camp. Under the guidance of 2 elderly Italian master masons, the prisoners began to forage with renewed purpose. They were given permission to collect local aggregates. They spent their days retrieving smooth river stones from the dry wash beds outside the camp boundary, selecting stones not just for structure, but for color and shape. They salvaged lumber from a long, closed mine. The work was painstaking, transforming basic mandated labor into an artistic endeavor of reclamation. Sergeant Miller clearly understood the silent message. These men were building a monument to their professional pride. Then came the true, emotional shift. The moment when the ingrained German propaganda about American cruelty finally fractured. One morning, a dusty, old civilian pickup truck rattled up to the main gate. The driver was a stout woman, accompanied by a local pastor. They were part of a small church group from the nearest town, miles away, and they had come with a delivery. Under a tarp lay 2 crates. Inside were dozens of small, irregular pieces of colored glass fragments from a church damaged in a fire. The pastor explained they heard the prisoners were building a sanctuary and wanted to contribute the sacred remnants of their own past to the effort. This was not an official army handout. It was a quiet, voluntary act of grace from the enemy population. Karl stood utterly speechless. He had expected contempt. Instead, he received a gift of salvaged beauty. He picked up a piece of deep cobalt blue glass, the desert light catching its inner fire. This simple, unauthorized donation of flawed materials was more powerful than any act of structural engineering he had ever witnessed. It was an offering of spiritual material for a spiritual need. Sergeant Miller, who had clearly arranged the gate clearance, gave Karl a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He had not supplied the materials directly, but he had opened the door for human kindness to breach the wire. Karl realized the fragments were pieces of shattered light, mirroring the broken but resilient men who would soon install them. As the German masons began meticulously sorting the precious stones and stained glass fragments, Karl knew they were no longer simply building a hall. They were building a bridge of unexpected mercy and shared humanity, stone by stone, under the vast, silent California sky, using the gifts of the people they had been taught to despise. What small act of kindness changed your perspective on an enemy? Tell us your story in the comments below. With the foundation poured and the materials sorted and prepared, the construction of the chapel began its agonizing, yet redemptive ascent toward the sky. The work was physically grueling, but the sense of shared purpose created a deep, unbreakable bond among the men. They were former enemies, now simply masons and carpenters working side by side. The rhythmic chunk of hammers and the low, muttered instructions in German formed the steady soundscape. This shared struggle was slowly but surely replacing years of ideological conditioning. Karl relied heavily on the 2 Italian prisoners, the old stonemasons. The older one, Giovanni, took Karl aside one morning. The Germans were struggling with the main archway. Giovanni explained the deep structural concept of the keystone. He demonstrated how every stone relies entirely on its neighbors for support, but it is the final, central piece, the keystone, that locks the entire structure into unyielding, permanent stability. Each piece is weak alone, Herr Ingenieur, Giovanni murmured. But together, and with the keystone of God, they last forever. This simple lesson in masonry became a profound parable for Karl. The men around him were all pieces of a broken arch, finally finding support and strength in one another through a shared, dignified goal. They spent days precisely cutting and shaping the irregular river stones. They mixed the mortar themselves, blending their European skill with the California soil. The work was detailed and slow, demanding a patience that the haste of war had nearly stripped from them. As the stone walls rose, they offered the first true physical refuge in the camp. The American guards, watching the sheer precision of the work, grew less vigilant. Miller would often pause at a distance to admire the clean lines of the walls. For Karl, the greatest satisfaction was the communal focus. When the massive keystone carved by Giovanni and Karl was finally lifted and set into place at the top of the main archway, the German prisoners stopped working. A low, unified cheer went up, not of triumph, but of profound satisfaction in the mastery of their craft. The arch stood, strong and beautiful. The men realized that the spiritual strength they sought was already present in the stone they had labored to lay. As the sturdy stone walls of the mission chapel rose higher, they began to command attention from the world outside the barbed wire. Local Californians could occasionally be seen pausing their vehicles, squinting across the open fields at the unbelievable sight of a rising mission. The locals were curious and understandably suspicious. The construction of a beautiful, permanent sanctuary by enemy hands was a baffling anomaly. Karl Hess and his crew worked with a renewed sense of performance, ensuring the carpentry was precise. Karl directed the construction of the intricate roof trusses and began carving the altar itself, transforming the discarded lumber into the devotional heart of the building. This highly visible, non-essential religious work soon caused a problem that threatened the entire project. A new, strict American lieutenant arrived for a surprise inspection tour, a man driven entirely by regulation and institutional distrust. He observed the men meticulously shaping the altar and immediately saw a violation of protocol. "Sergeant Miller," the lieutenant barked, pointing toward the specialized carving tools. "This is not authorized labor. Confiscate the tools and assign them to digging latrines." The sudden order hung heavy and cold in the still air. Karl and the other men stopped working instantly, their hearts sinking. But Sergeant Miller stepped forward, calm and unhurried. Miller said, his voice quiet but firm, "The War Department guidelines stipulate that labor should be used to support prisoner morale. These men are the best-behaved crew. They are highly motivated by this project." Miller continued, "They are building this chapel for their own spiritual well-being while in our custody. The structure improves morale. It is a highly efficient use of labor, saving the Army resources and preventing trouble." The lieutenant frowned deeply, unable to counter the logic of efficiency. He reluctantly conceded, "Very well, Miller, but if one man is late for muster, the project is finished. Understood?" The quiet act of protection transformed the mood of the construction site. Karl returned to the altar carving, realizing that the chapel was not only a shelter for the men's faith, but a silent testament to the moral confidence of the nation that allowed its enemy to build something beautiful in its own backyard. Stories like this of enemies becoming human are too important to keep quiet. If this moment of quiet defiance and dignity resonated with you, share this video with someone who needs to see the power of human respect. The short, cold days of the desert winter descended upon Camp Cady. The chapel stood fully enclosed, and only the delicate work remained, the fitting of the windows. This was the task Karl Hess had waited for. He and the men deliberately set each irregular piece of colored glass into the wooden frames. The fragments were mismatched, a chaotic collection, but Karl meticulously arranged them to create a mosaic that was imperfect, yet deeply resonant, a perfect metaphor for the men themselves. The culmination came on the afternoon they installed the main window over the altar. The low winter sun filtered through the glass. The effect was astonishing. The interior of the chapel, once just a hollow shell, was instantly transformed into a sacred space, shimmering with a borrowed, peaceful glory. That night was Christmas Eve. Sergeant Miller ensured the patrol paths were conveniently routed away. 40 German prisoners slipped silently into the unfinished chapel. They sat on crates. One man began to softly hum Stille Nacht. Soon, others joined in, filling the new stone chamber with a beloved, familiar sound of home. Karl, the longtime skeptic, sat near the back. He had approached the chapel as an engineering challenge. Yet, as the sound of the German hymn resonated, a profound realization washed over him. He was sitting in a sanctuary built not for his captors, but for the survival of his own spirit. He looked at the men who had endured the struggles of the conflict, now finding solace in a simple tune. He understood that the Americans had given them the greatest gift of captivity, the dignity of meaningful work. The light on the floor felt like a visible manifestation of hope and grace. Karl ended the night realizing he had inadvertently designed a cathedral for the soul. By early spring of 1945, the chapel stood finally finished, its stone walls glowing golden under the Californian sun, crowned by the simple, hand-hammered cross. It was immaculate, a beautiful, unlikely anomaly created by enemy hands on enemy soil, and it was ready for its formal dedication. Sergeant Miller arranged the dedication ceremony, inviting local community members. Watching American civilians walk into the structure they built was deeply surreal for the German prisoners. The ceremony itself was a study in profound irony. The local pastor spoke eloquently of peace, forgiveness, and the enduring power of faith. He lauded the craftsmanship of the builders and thanked the Army for its moral decency. Karl knew the pastor spoke a deep truth, but he also knew the superficial truth. The beautiful, strong chapel was a physical symbol of the ideological collapse he had experienced. As the ceremony concluded, Karl felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The chapel was not a victory for the United States. It was a victory for the human capacity to transcend conflict through creation. It was a monument to the integrity of the men who built it, and to the moral confidence of the men who allowed it to be built without interference. It was in the stillness following the ceremony that the world outside crashed in. Sergeant Miller walked onto the site, carrying a hastily printed telegram. The air was charged with a tension far greater than any construction deadline. He gathered the German men, his face grave and solemn. "Listen closely," he said through the interpreter. "The news is confirmed. Adolf Hitler is reported to have taken his own life in his bunker. Germany has surrendered." The simple words struck the men like a physical blow. The war, the defining horror of their adult lives, was simply over. The reaction was stunned, deep silence. Some men began to weep softly. Karl stood rigid, staring at the strong, silent stone facade of the chapel. All the engineering, all the defiance, it now seemed small against the sheer, devastating finality of the news. He walked slowly into the chapel. The colored light fell across his face. He looked at the altar he had spent days carving. He realized the building's purpose had just shifted completely. It was no longer a temporary sanctuary. It was a memorial to the time they survived. Karl realized with a profound ache that the war was finished. But the journey home, the true, difficult journey of rebuilding their lives, was only just beginning. The official end of the European conflict brought a deep, bureaucratic quiet to Camp Cady. The purpose of their captivity had vanished, replaced by the tedious, agonizing machinery of repatriation. For Karl Hess, the immediate focus was the final service in the mission chapel. They gathered for the last time as builders and worshippers. Karl, no longer a hardened skeptic, stood silently by the altar he had helped carve, understanding the profound value of spiritual resilience. In the days that followed, the prisoners were processed. Karl packed his few personal belongings. He noticed the American guards and German prisoners shared a palpable tension of farewell, a strange mix of relief and regret. On the day the trucks arrived, Sergeant Miller approached Karl near the main gate. "The chapel," Miller began, adjusting his hat, "is a fine piece of work, Hess. The Army is proud to have it here, and the locals have taken an interest." Karl nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you, Sergeant, for the materials, for the trust you showed us." "You earned it, engineer," Miller replied simply. He handed Karl a small item wrapped in clean white cloth. It was a black and white photograph of the finished chapel, its stone facade gleaming against the desert sky. "So you do not forget the work," Miller said. Karl took the photograph. This piece of paper held more truth about the world than all the propaganda posters he had seen. He looked at the sergeant, a representative of the enemy, who had consistently treated him with professional dignity. "I hated America when I arrived, Sergeant," Karl admitted. "I believed the lies. But I leave with respect for the men who let me build. You showed us that your nation is strong enough not to humiliate its enemies." Miller offered a rare, slight smile. "We were just trying to get a job done, engineer. You built a good one." He offered a firm handshake. As Karl climbed into the truck, he watched the camp recede the water tower, and finally, the sturdy, beautiful stone arch of the chapel. It stood as a beacon of stability. Karl tucked the photograph deep into his pocket, knowing that the greatest structure he had built was not made of stone, but of the moral conviction that humanity could still be found. That photograph was his most vital souvenir. Decades later, the simple stone chapel in the California desert remained. It was a physical contradiction, a monument to German skill and American decency, standing resolute against the relentless sun. Karl Hess returned to his fractured homeland, not as a broken soldier, but as a profoundly changed man. The simple, black and white photograph of the finished chapel in the Mojave Desert served as a constant, tangible reminder that dignity could not only be preserved, but could flourish even in the deepest humiliation of defeat and captivity. The experience had stripped him of nationalistic fervor, replacing it with a keen appreciation for foundational strength, both moral and structural. His unexpected knowledge of American construction techniques, combined with his fluent English honed during his time as a POW, immediately became indispensable assets in the massive, daunting task of post-war German reconstruction. Karl channeled his desert-forged resilience into building a successful and distinguished career as a civil engineer, focusing specifically on strong, lasting structures, bridges, municipal buildings, and infrastructure designed to withstand the tests of time, much like the stone chapel he had helped raise. In the mid-1970s, long retired and with the chaos of the war decades behind him, Karl decided to make a private, deeply personal pilgrimage back to the remote site of his captivity. Driving his car across the vast, shimmering stretches of the desert highway, a landscape that felt both familiar and alien, he was entirely uncertain what he would find. The desert is a harsh mistress. It claims what is left to neglect. Had the U.S. government demolished it? Has nature reclaimed it? But as he approached the familiar basin, past the dusty remnants of what was once Camp Cady, the unmistakable silhouette rose with stark clarity from the plain. The watchtowers and the ugly lines of barbed wire were gone, absorbed back into the earth, but the chapel stood exactly as he and his comrades had left it, impeccably preserved, a solitary stone sentinel against the relentless blue sky. Karl parked his car and walked slowly across the silent, sun-baked ground, the crunch of gravel under his shoes the only sound. His hand, now marked by the years of a demanding professional life, reached out and traced the rough, honest texture of the dark stones he had personally laid. The large keystone, the heart of the arch, still bore the faint, distinctive tooling marks, the physical record of their desperate struggle for purpose. With a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy wooden door. It creaked only slightly, a sound that echoed across the decades. Inside, the light, filtered through the salvaged stained glass, still cast its beautiful, fractured colors, deep sapphires, rubies, and golds onto the dust-speckled concrete floor, exactly as it had done 50 years prior. The air was cool, smelling faintly of dry stone and sanctity. On a small altar, he found a newly framed bronze plaque, dedicating the chapel to the prisoners of war of Camp Cady, whose skills and faith built this sanctuary. There was no mention of victory or defeat, no glorification of war, only an acknowledgement of the human effort that built a sanctuary. Karl sat on an old, varnished wooden bench. In that quiet moment, all the lingering doubts and the corrosive effects of German propaganda melted away. He realized that the true, enduring strength of the American system was not its industrial capacity or its military might, but its moral consistency, its stubborn, steadfast commitment to decency, respect, and the rule of law, even for the captured enemy. He knew then that the lasting legacy of that chapel was not the building itself, but the thousands of stories like his, carried back to Germany by former prisoners who had witnessed an enemy that respected human dignity. These men, hardened by conflict but softened by grace, became the first human bridges between the newly adversarial nations, laying the moral foundation for the post-war German-American alliance. When Karl passed away years later, his family placed the original black and white photograph of the chapel in a place of honor. It was a quiet, powerful reminder that the greatest, most enduring monument to peace is often built not after conflict, but during it, through the simple, transformative act of allowing your enemy the dignity to build. The chapel in the desert stands today, an enduring, humbling testament to the surprising truth that sometimes the greatest victory is earned through the quiet grace of mutual respect. That was the incredible, true story of how American moral confidence led German POWs to build a timeless monument to human dignity. If you were moved by Karl Hess's journey from a prisoner of war to a professional engineer, a story built on respect, not revenge, then you are in the right place. We publish profound, forgotten chapters of history like this every week. Hit the subscribe button right now so you don't miss our next story of unbelievable historical survival. And if you enjoyed this journey into the Mojave, please tap the like button to help this video reach more people curious about the surprising side of history. Thank you for watching.